Well, thank you, Paige, and hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Tight Budgets, Tough Choices. I'm Robert, and I'm here today with my friend and prominent attorney, Adrian Adams. Adrian, can I get you to say hello to everyone?
Well, hello, everyone, from sunny, rain-starved Los Angeles.
Well, we're here to have a chat today about what's revealed about your priorities by the choices that you make in times of scarcity. Now, you see it regularly in your life in the tension or strategy changes at the ends of a football game, or maybe in the bottom of the ninth inning of a baseball game. But today we're going to talk about what we see when money is tight. Now, in a football game or a baseball game, it's clear what the objective is: to win, to score more points than the other team. But in our years of experience, Adrian and I have found that in order for managers and board members to have success in the budget process, we need to back up a bit and talk about the rules of the game and what it means to win. Then the boards and managers can develop their own strategy and style to deal with that scarcity. Well, as Paige indicated earlier, this course is now approved for continuing education credit through CAMICB. Those of you who indicated in the registration process, you managers, that you were CMCA certified will receive a certificate of completion within a week. And a few housekeeping comments before we get going. As a reminder, this is a live presentation. I'm trying to sit still because I just realized my chair is squeaking, and everyone's been muted to keep the background noise to a minimum. I want to point out a few controls that appear on your screen. Adrian and I like interactive presentation. We're actually doing this program next week to a live audience in person. Anyway, so every once in a while we may ask for your feedback, and the way to do that is to respond by raising your hand. It'll be done by clicking that hands raised icon in your control panel that looks like the one that you see on screen. And if you came with a question, or if at any time you have a question that pops up due to something that we've said, just type it in the dialog box in your control panel, again, similar to what you've seen on screen. Paige is going to be monitoring that in the background through our session today, and she'll select from those at the end during our Q&A time. Well, I hope you have some paper and are taking notes. We hope to really present some value for you. But just to give you some peace of mind, I want to let you know that the session today is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website for future reference. We'll create and send an outline to all attendees who fill out a survey at the end of today's session. So let's give that a try to see how attentive you are. Grab your mouse and give me a click on the hands raised icon to show me that you're ready to get going on the presentation. Hands raised, everybody? Nice. See hands getting raised up and down the list. Okay, I'm going to put hands down and we'll get off on our presentation. So, Adrian, let me ask you first, what's a board member's responsibility? What's kind of the rules of the game to get this budget process going?
Well, when it comes to associations, common interest developments, the nature of a common interest development across all 50 states is that they have common areas. And so from that flows everything that we're going to talk about for this, this webinar. And that is they have a duty to maintain those common areas. That's their primary duty. And if they have a duty to maintain, then how can they maintain unless they raise the money to do that? So they have an obligation to assess. And in California, it's actually a statutory requirement that they assess sufficient to meet their obligations as an association. And so from the duty to assess then comes the third element, and that third element is how do you know what to assess or how much to assess? So they have an obligation then to create a budget, and they have to look at, as part of that budgetary process, the large components, to find out what's it going to cost to replace a roof, how long is that roof going to last. So they have to do a reserve study, and again that's also required in California that they, by statute, that they actually perform a study. And I know it's required in a number of other states. You'd have a better idea of how many others out there now require that.
Yeah, it's about 25, but let me bounce it back to you, Adrian. What do you see as the most common error that board members make in mistaking their priority? You've talked
Well,
about it being to maintain the common areas, and they need to
yes.
raise the money to do it. What's the biggest mistake you see there?
And doing the reserve study to know how much money to prepare, I think the biggest mistake is their fourth obligation, and that is they have a duty to spend that money.
Yeah.
Which means then, once they've raised the money, they put the money aside into reserves, too many boards feel it's part of their duty to not touch that money, but to have that big nest egg there. And actually it's just the opposite. They need to be building that money, but then they have a duty to spend it, because there are going to be consequences, which we're going to talk about later in the webinar. If they don't spend that money, it's going to end up costing them a lot more for the association, and they create all kinds of potential legal liability if they don't.
Yeah. Well, let's change the subject a little bit to a little bit more of the rules of the game, not just board members, but how are their decisions measured? How do they know how they're doing?
You're asking me?
Yeah.
Okay, well, well, if they're making good decisions, they're going to have the money, they're going to have the property maintained. If they're making bad decisions, what's going to happen is they're going to end up doing a lot of special assessments, and there's going to be threats of lawsuits or actual lawsuits involving maintenance issues and reserve issues, many of which I've been involved in over the years as an expert in the industry testifying on these issues.
Yeah, when I think about it, obviously I see it primarily from the side of reserves, but there's so much that's in the operating budget too, and that operating budget is just having enough money to get the carpets vacuumed and getting the pool cleaned and maybe some fresh flowers out front by the entry sign. But I see every budget decision as being very measurable. The budget is a document that's archived in association records, and just as you indicated, the boards are responsible to collect the appropriate amount of money. All those decisions are documented, and it'll be shown what is foolish and what is wise in retrospect. So you want to be careful what you're doing. And again, when I see things, and my vision is just from the reserves point of view, I see when they don't collect the money and when they don't spend it, I see deterioration, and that leads to disappointment, and that leads to discouragement. Those are all just bad things that happen, and that's why we have this wise and foolish scale. There's a big slippery slope that you go down when you start not collecting enough money. But tell me, isn't there a business judgment rule test?
Well, yeah, there is. The boards of directors are allowed, one of their duties is to make decisions on behalf of the association. One of the things they're going to be judged on as whether they were good decisions or not is whether they followed the business judgment rule. That is pretty much across all 50 states. You're going to have this similar provision because it originated in the corporation's code, which is similar from state to state. And what that means is boards are obligated to make decisions in good faith, in the best interests of the association, and as a reasonably prudent person would do, which means that they have to conduct reasonable inquiry or due diligence before they make their decisions.
Because they can't be experts in all fields.
Exactly. Well, and here's the nice thing about the business judgment rule, is that when they make these decisions, this rule will protect them from personal liability. So that what that means is if they make a mistake in their decision and it ends up getting the association sued and damages are awarded for $100,000, the board members are not personally liable for those damages. The association will have to pay them, but not the individual directors. And that's if they follow the business judgment rule.
Yeah. Okay, well, nice. How is that different from a manager's responsibility? Same association, but different people sitting in the room. You have board members making decisions, the manager there. Tell me about the manager's responsibility.
Well, the managers don't have the same level of scrutiny and duty that the board members do. The board members are elected, and as soon as they become elected, they have what's known as a fiduciary duties for the membership. Managers are not in that role. They have a different role. They're hired by the association, and what they become is what's up on the screen here. Their duty is to guide the board. They manage the assets. They take direction from the board, but the board, as you pointed out, they're all volunteers, and they don't necessarily have any expertise in this area, whereas managers do. And so their duty is to coach the board, to counsel the board, to guide them, all of these points that you have on the screen here, and educate them, because managers are much more knowledgeable in these things than individual board members are.
Sometimes I want to say cajole them, because the managers, if they're a portfolio manager, they may have, 10 properties that they're responsible for, and they want to try to keep these cats moving forward in the right direction, remind them of their responsibilities, and not let them just be drifting.
Yeah, and one of the problems that for managers in particular is that sometimes boards don't listen to them, and they can go off the beaten path into directions that are not industry standards, and
or maybe
even
foolish, as we showed a moment ago.
Yes, yeah, where boards decide that, you know what, we're not going to put any money aside into reserves because we want to keep our assessments low, and we think that's good for the membership and good for property values. It'll raise our property values, and I've heard that argument made by boards. And what's going to happen is if they're not putting aside those monies into reserves, they're going to at some point get hit with big special assessments. And then if you've got a new board in place that's faced with that, they may be looking to the manager and going, manager, how come you guys didn't deal with this? How come you didn't tell us that we needed to be putting aside monies? And so for managers, it puts them in an awkward position where the board may be looking to either fire them or sue them because they didn't give them good advice. And when managers are in the position where they're advising boards, telling them that they need to be doing this, and the board completely ignores their advice, the manager needs to document the record in some way, whether it be following up with an email back to the board or a letter saying, look, I understand, I've advised you to do the following, you disagree, you want to take a different path, okay, I will follow that path. But even that can put the manager sometimes at risk, where a board feels like they're being set up. So
set up
for litigation.
Got it.
So what a manager can do is simply document to the file a memo to the file that doesn't get sent to the board, but simply says, I advise the board on such and such a date, to do the following with reserves, and they elected not to follow my advice, but to do the following.
Got it.
So that 2 years later, when there are threats of lawsuits and boards are upset, they can point to the memo and say, look, I told you guys.
Yeah.
So just for the manager's point of view, that's kind of their role in this process, and where they sometimes are themselves at risk, and how they can help alleviate that risk.
Yeah. Well, I just want to make sure the managers are clear that although the board is the body that ultimately is responsible, they make the decisions, they're the owners, it's their money going into assessments, the manager has power, and that's being this coach or this guide and doing their job to manage, while at the same time understanding that the board has ultimate responsibility. But from my point of view, I also see too many times where the manager is just there as a note taker, someone who pays the bills, someone who just reports back on the monthly delinquencies or the bank account, and missing an entirely great opportunity to help the association get forward. And it's some words that came to mind in our discussion was when they're apathetic, when they turn into an observer, when they're not helping the board by telling them, this will happen when you keep doing that, or not having standards, telling them that at other associations, CAI standards, or AICPA standards or state law even standards. When the manager is not taking advantage of those opportunities to tell them what they know, that's just enabling.
Yes, and well, another point on that is that managers are, and the whole entire industry, CAI has been working to build managers as professionals and educating them, certifying them, and they need to actually behave as professionals and do their job to help these volunteers on the board to guide them to what they need to do. Because I'll tell you, a lot of the litigation that I see over the years is involving maintenance issues and usually large-scale maintenance that hasn't gotten done because the reserves are inadequate.
And getting undone because they just didn't have the money or they didn't want to pull the trigger?
Well, usually because they don't have the money. They haven't been setting aside the money.
Yeah. That takes planning. That takes insight. That takes a board that's got to hear from their manager that this is what happens when that happens. A manager telling them that, well, let's go to the next slide. Let's talk really about budgets now. We talked about kind of the ground rules, the different roles that people play, but the bills now. You got the bills, and they're going to come in two parts. Generally, the operating budget and the reserve budget. Obviously, I see things from the reserve budget side of things. Adrian, you've spoken about how the big problems, the big ones that hit the fan, are the plumbing problems, the roofing problems, the big expense problems, not the little daily, weekly, monthlies, but those daily, weekly, monthlies. My wife says death by a thousand razor cuts. Isn't that something, a phrase along those lines?
I agree with you. I mean, I see the problems coming on both ends, but it's mostly the reserve side. The operating budget is usually fine to take care of day-to-day business, and boards will budget appropriately, and they'll take care of the ongoing expenses, vacuuming the floors and taking care of the landscaping. And what I see is the boards will come to me at some point and say, look, we're very proud that we've been able for the last 10 or 15 years keep our budget, our dues level. We've never had to increase dues.
Yikes.
So that tells me that they are deferring maintenance and that they're not putting sufficient funds into reserve budget. Because if you keep your budget at a standstill, then what it's actually doing is shrinking, because you've got ongoing inflation. It's been fairly low over the last 5 years or so, but they need to be taking care of business, which means that, as I said, at least in California, statutorily, by law, they're required to assess sufficient to meet their needs.
Right.
And too many boards are not doing that.
Well, what is discretionary? If you could rate the hard expenses versus the soft expenses, can you touch on those a little bit?
Well, between operating and reserves, two different kinds of things. Operating, like, as I said, the landscaping, if they're doing it daily, they might cut it back to 3 days a week. Or vacuuming the hallways, if they're doing it daily, they might do it 2 or 3 times a week. So that's more of the discretionary kinds of things. But for reserves, the problem is that on the operating side, if they cut back on discretionary kinds of things, members usually will be impacted immediately, and they put pressure back on the board.
Yeah, if 3 times a week, let's use that vacuuming illustration. If 3 times a week isn't cutting it, the board's going to get pressure, and they're going to go back up to daily.
Exactly.
Okay.
But on the reserve side, what they can do is they can start cutting back on that, and nobody sees it until disaster hits. And so that's why I'm saying most of the problems I see are all on the reserve side, because they haven't been contributing. They've been cutting back on the amount that they contribute. They've allowed their reserve levels to fall dramatically, and and that's when they get themselves in trouble and get sued. Now, are there discretionary items within the reserve budget? I think you can probably address that more easily than I can.
Yes, there's some discretionary items. Actually have a slide on that in just a few minutes, but following up on this point, I want to make the point that reserve expenses are as real as any of those operating budget expenses. And to echo what you said, they just don't see them because all these expenses here, they're going to happen. Even that big expense out 25 years, it may happen in the 24th or 23rd year. It may split into 2 years, but that's a big asphalt expense or roof expense that is going to happen. And you need to start the set-asides now because that cost of ongoing deterioration is very real. And if you aren't setting that money aside now, you're just kicking the can down the road and you're going to get behind and someone else is going to have to pay that same bill. It's kind of like in the swim races that we saw so recently in the Olympics. There's a pace line there, and if you're not providing enough reserve contributions to keep up with that moving, ongoing cost of deterioration, you're going to fall behind. And that gap between the ongoing deterioration and your reserve contributions, that's basically the special assessment gap. And you can see that coming. You can see that when the association is behind on their reserve contributions and therefore behind in their reserve fund, it'll become a pinch time, and that's special assessment. Either special assessment or patent deterioration, obvious deterioration. And again, that leads to disappointment and discouragement and lower property values and lots of bad things happening. The point I want to make here when we're focusing on budget is that reserve contributions are bills. The association needs to see them as bills and not see them as luxuries. Luxuries are very discretionary things. Do you want the red Ferrari? Do you want a boat? But you're not going to wonder if you're going to pay the power bill. You're not going to wonder if you pay the insurance bill. You may have a little bit of discretion on the size of the deductible, but reserves are a bill just like any other at the association. If you don't pay them, you run out of money, and that's when you have special assessments and deferred maintenance, and again, lots of bad things happening, but there's no running from them. The fundamental reserve bills aren't discretionary. Adrian, our next slide is a little bit back to you. We've talked about the role of the board member, the role of the manager, how reserve expenses are as real as any other bill, but talk about the guidelines given in an association's governing documents that basically tell the boards, in addition to those other things, what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, in addition to various states having statutes requiring reserves to be set aside, many associations will have in their governing documents requirements that they reserve or that they maintain the common areas in a certain condition. Well, this is from a set of CC&Rs for an association that I was called in on because they got sued. And what happened was the board had done exactly as I mentioned before. They decided not to raise dues, not to contribute monies into reserves, but to keep everything artificially low because they had an elderly membership and a lot of elderly members in their community, and so they were concerned about them, those individuals, and so they kept the dues artificially low. And what happened was this particular association, the roofs, they band-aided and band-aided and band-aided. They didn't. They deferred, and finally the roofs failed, and they failed dramatically. And what happened was they got sued, of course, because they now had to impose special assessments. And one of the things that came up at the time of trial was the CC&R provision that said that they had to maintain their common areas in a first-class condition. And that became a huge problem and a sticking element in the trial. And I was actually on the stand, and the judge told the two lawyers to sit down. Well, he turned and started asking me questions about what did it mean to be in a first-class condition in an association. And that is problem language in a set of CC&Rs. And I would advise all associations take a good look at your CC&Rs. And if you've got something like that in there, amend your CC&Rs to say good condition rather than first class.
Well, you said something in there that I wrote it down, and it was the board members paying more attention to what they perceived were the sensitivities of the owners and not paying attention to what their governing document said and their fundamental responsibility to maintain the assets of the corporation. I see that as an incredible error.
Yes. Yeah, their duty is not to the individual members, but to the association as a whole and to the governing documents. And if the law and the governing documents tell them they have to maintain their common elements, then that's their duty, and they have to do that regardless of whether an individual owner could afford it or not.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Well, we had this slide kind of maybe could have fit a little bit earlier, but even in reserves, there are some things that are discretionary. There's some inconsequential failures, and for most associations, it's inconsequential for the pool heater to go out. It's not like Catastrophe. You just get a new pool heater and the pool will cool down for a couple of days. There's some things that possibly you reevaluate, like a perimeter fence. You give it the old shake test, give it a wiggle, see if it's still sturdy. There's some things that maybe are in that middle range obsolescence, which might be a rec room remodel. Not critical, but you don't want to let it go too long. But definitely the kind of reserve project you don't want to delay are the projects that have to do with protection, maybe protection of property like the front entry gate or the roof, keeping it nice and watertight, or the decks, sealing the decks, and catastrophic things like, I guess my first example was a pool boiler. A catastrophic thing would be a hot water heater for a 50-unit condo. When that goes out, and everyone has cold water, and boy, the board's going to hear about that. So there's some things that you actually want to do preemptively. There's some of those projects that you can do to protect the assets. I indicated doing your roof sealing or asphalt sealing on time. Those projects, yes, they're expensive, but boy, they end up saving the association a lot of money. This is an example of an association that failed to seal their asphalt. Asphalt sealing is about 15-20 cents a square foot, and because they didn't do that a couple times, they're ending up having to totally resurface the asphalt, and that's, in this situation, probably about $4 a square foot. So they just shot themselves in the foot by, as you indicated earlier, not spending the money when it's time to. So they've got to be balancing that budget.
Go back to that slide for a second.
Sure.
In addition to being much more costly because they deferred maintenance, they didn't do the proper sealing, they let it go, and then now they're getting all of this. You've got, if you'll see in there, see the potholes? If somebody is riding a bicycle or walking, they twist their ankle, they break their ankle. We have right now one association that is being sued a huge amount of money because a bicyclist who happened to be 70 years old hit a pothole and had some catastrophic injuries. So your cost could be much greater than simply the cost of having now to replace all this asphalt. You could get sued and have to deal with those expenses as well.
I hadn't even thought about that. When I look at this slide, I see deteriorated asphalt, but that's why you're here, because you see liability. So that's fantastic. Okay, so it's all about balancing the budget. We spoke about board member responsibilities, our encouragement to managers to be a guide, to help make sure they have enough money to receive. They set the budget income appropriately, and then are spending it appropriately. Can we emphasize one more time that the board's obligation is to the association and not individual squeaking homeowners?
Yes. Yeah, the squeaky wheel is the one that they hear, but they need to sometimes not pay attention so much to that squeaky wheel, but to their duties under their governing documents and the law.
Yeah. So often the biggest mistake I see is boards who just say, well, we just can't do it. We're going to keep our assessments the same as last year, and that is, as you know, just kicking the can down the road. But as you've pointed out earlier, the board's obligation is to the association to make sure they have the money to operate. And if people can't afford it, I'm sure everyone has their own um, discretionary. So rather than the board making a discretionary decision for them, isn't it true that the board should put the assessments at where they need to be and then allow the individual homeowners to decide what their cable plans are and their when they buy their new car and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, let me address that for a minute. I think it's a mistake for boards to say we simply can't afford it, we're not going to raise dues, and they continue to say that from year to year for 10, 15 years. Because what's going to really happen is that at some point when the huge special assessments hit, then you've got people being pushed out of their homes because they truly can't afford it. Whereas if they had been doing small increases as they went along to keep pace, then people can start planning. They can say, okay, I can see, if this continues, that I'm going to, in a few years, I'm not going to be able to afford to live here. I better start looking now to find another home. I can put this one on the market. I can sell, and I can move to something that's more affordable. And it's easier for people to plan. One association I represented, they brought me in when they got to a point where they had been deferring for not 10 years, 15 years, but 20, 30 years of defer, and then they were facing 20% dues increases for a period of two years in a row and a $75,000 special assessment per unit.
Yikes.
And there you got people who are walking away from their units, losing what they had, little they had in those units, or threatening to declare bankruptcy, the association not being able to collect the assessments. I mean, it's a catastrophe.
Yeah, all because they weren't setting a truthful budget. They were dealing with fiction and fantasy.
Yes.
Okay, so what we want to encourage our listeners today is that look at the numbers and see the truth of the numbers. You can't push the numbers around too far. Maybe you can see where the softness is, as we talked about earlier, looking at how often the pool is cleaned or the hallways are vacuumed. But there's some things that's just what it costs at the association. And we need to make sure you understand that the key to success comes from having enough money for the association to function and having the owners understand the truth of the matter and not telling them fiction time after time after time about, well, we're just going to kick this can down the road and we'll deal with this problem, which is only going to get bigger at some future point in time.
Well, let me add to that. If they do that, and as these boards did, this board I was just talking about, who deferred, and went from board to board to board, what happens is when it finally hits those huge special assessments, people turn around and sue the board of directors. They sue the board members individually. And then you have a problem with the business judgment rule. Were they following, oh, there you go, this slide lays it out. Were they acting in the best interest of the association, in good faith, in the best interest of the association, and with due diligence? Yeah. And arguably, you could make the argument that they weren't, which means that they could be then personally liable for not having done their duties.
Absolutely. Well, one more thing is that there's so many associations out there that are just so tempted to throw up their hands. We can't raise assessments, and I think the encouragement that I want to give today is that they may have gotten into this situation over a decade or two or three, and so it may take a few years to get to that good future, but it starts with courageous action now and increasing the homeowner assessments a little bit and starting to get on the right path and starting to maybe deal with the truth and saying that, well, we need to raise assessments 5% this year, and there'll probably be a series of 5% annual increases, but getting them there so they can start dealing with the truth of the matter and preventing that crisis. If they wait too long and all of a sudden they have a 20% increase or maybe a series of 20% increases, then that's a backbreaking challenge for the association.
Well, let me give you an example from another association where I was called in as an expert on. They were sued. They had been funded, their funding levels either at 7 or 12%, I don't remember what it was, and which is horribly low. And the new board came in, recognized the problem, and set aside and started raising the dues and started putting money into reserves. and they had a plan for getting to the point they needed to be.
So they started down the path.
Yes, they actually started doing this where they were now starting to build their reserves. And the plan they were on, in fact, would have succeeded, except that partway into the plan, what happened was their plumbing system failed catastrophically, and is due to an unknown defect. They didn't know there was a defect in the system, and they were well beyond the 10-year statute limitations for suing the developers, so they were on their own. And what happened was a person who recently bought into the association turned around and sued everybody. And well, in fact, the person who bought in, it never fails, was a lawyer. And so the lawyer turned around and sued all the directors, the association as a corporation, and sued the manager. And when we went to trial on the matter, one of the things that I pointed out to the court and showed them the chart was that under the funding plan that they were on, they would have been fine, and they would have made it. There wouldn't have been any major special assessments. They had a series of smaller ones planned, and let everybody know in advance. And these reserve contributions and dues increases were going to be planned out over time so people could absorb it, and it would have worked, but for the catastrophic failure due to the defect.
And you can't sue a catastrophic failure because it's a thing. The board had been making a good plan.
Yes, and the court recognized that, and as a result, the association prevailed in the lawsuit. The plaintiff lost.
Good. Okay. Well, we want to encourage you that this is serious business. Your priorities are revealed by what you do in times of scarcity. So there are tough decisions. We want to encourage all the board members, the managers, the business partners to understand that these are important decisions. We want to encourage you to know what your responsibilities are, how you play a role in getting towards a successful future. And that, as I look at the clock now, we're running out of time. So I want to thank you for joining us today. There's so much. As Adrian and I were preparing for this, we realized we could almost do a, was it 8-part or 10-part mini-series on this, Adrian?
Yes, yeah. I'm sure we could.
There's a lot of material. I feel like we've only touched the surface, and because of that, we have some additional resources on our websites, reservestay.com for association reserves, adamsterling.com for the Adam Sterling Law Firm. At the reservestay.com website, there's a learning center. You can request proposals. You can join our email list where you'll get newsletters and announcements of future webinars. And the same for Adrian. You can see his adamsterling.com website, and that links to davissterling.com, a tremendous resource of insights on running the association, effective decision making. You can sign up where the red arrow is to get his almost weekly email newsletter when he's not too busy helping his paying clients. He has a little bit of time to write a weekly newsletter. But we want to thank you so much for entrusting us with 45 minutes of your time today. We hope that we've given you both some guidelines, some challenges, and some encouragement that you don't have to solve it all right now, but you can start moving in the right direction, because we want to be a part of you having a successful, productive community. So Paige, can you maybe handle a few questions and then wrap us up?
Absolutely. Thank you both. That was a great presentation.